Welcome to the Living the International Life podcast, where we discuss all topics from studying, working, and living abroad, and even language learning. And I'm your host, Jazz Cole, president and founder of Multilingual and Philanthropic Incorporated. Let's dive right in. Welcome, everyone, to the Living the International Life podcast, where we talk about all things from working, studying, and even living abroad. And this podcast came about just to share experiences within that space, outside of just my experiences as the founder of Multilingual and Philanthropic Incorporated. So today we have Kaelyn Apple, who is the founder of Accepted Consulting, co-founder of Accepted Society, and is also known as the Redhead Academic on YouTube, not to mention that she is a Ph.D. candidate at Yale University studying African American Studies and currently working on her dissertation in London. So that's a really big resume. Yeah.
Yes, it is quite vast.
So I don't know, I thought I was busy in college. I did a lot of things. But anyway, I know that you often mention that you went from a low high school GPA and you were riding horses professionally, going to community college, then Oxford, and then now you're at Yale. So what was your journey like seriously pursuing academic success outside of just telling yourself college is just not for me and just kind of just giving up on that aspect altogether?
Yeah, so in high school, I think a little bit of context is that in middle school, when I was a kid, my parents got a divorce, and that had me basically split between different school districts. And so that meant that when I went to high school, I actually changed districts, in which case I lost all my friends and I didn't have much community. And so I went into a school in an area of California that is incredibly competitive. In the public, even though it's a public school, it acts kind of like a private school. And a lot of the students were high achievers. They had tutors since they were much younger. And I just didn't have the skills and the support to succeed in those spaces. And I just felt like I didn't really know how to navigate them. And so when I was in high school, I didn't have community, and I didn't really feel like I knew exactly how it is to study to succeed. And so I basically just kind of pulled back and just focused on the things the spaces where I did really feel at home, which was as an athlete and as a horseback rider. And I give that context because I think that when telling the story of how it is that I transitioned from having an incredibly low GPA and really struggling in school and really feeling like that space wasn't meant for me, I found both the passion for the subject, so the passion for history, and more specifically for trying to focus on Black history and the study of Black feminist thought, and also finding community within academic spaces. Because as a non-traditional student, I was coming into it with a very different perspective of somebody who, after high school, had gone on to having an athletics career and feeling like I was really only valued for my physical abilities. And then moving into this space where I had this interest, I had these questions about history that I was interested in pursuing, and felt like I was finally met with people that were willing to actually engage in those conversations with me and show me a better way to do things. And so in terms of the question of finding academic success, I think it really came about in community college, where I discovered a love of history, and where I also found people that were willing to kind of foster that passion and say, okay, well, even if you're not necessarily really good at these things, let's work together in order to carve out these spaces for you and for other students like you. And so that really resulted in me finding success at UCLA when I started doing research as an undergraduate transfer, and the goal was never actually to stay in academia. The goal at the time was that I thought I wanted to go to law school. And I thought I wanted to go study constitutional law and become like a legal history scholar with more of a legal background. However, it wasn't until I really got into the research that I realized that history and going the way of African American studies and Black studies was the way that I was finding the answers to the questions that I had about the past. And that's a very long-winded way of saying that I think it's important to provide the context of it's not just about the study skills and kind of dedicating oneself to their studies, but also that you find community and you find belonging in the spaces that you once really felt that you didn't belong in.
Yeah, it makes sense, because I think when I was 18, I was like, I'm from Lexington, Kentucky. I was like, I don't want to be here. I immediately moved to California. The only school I applied to was FITM. I got in as a junior, and I was like, well, I'm done. I'm gone. So it was just kind of it's a very traditional environment. And I was studying fashion design at the time. That was what I was really, really interested in. And so I just felt like that wasn't here. And so I felt like I had to move away to kind of get into that community. It was like when I got to college, it was like, oh, like I found my people. Because it's like, I don't know, it's like, I feel like sometimes like middle school and high school, it gets like really clique-ish. And if you don't fit into those categories, it's like, well, I'm just here, you know?
Yeah. And I struggled a lot with finding, I was a very socially awkward teenager, and I had a lot of trouble finding my people and finding my community. But in addition to that, I'd moved to a new district, and about, I think it was like 3 months into the semester, I had a really serious, almost fatal riding accident. And I had a fall off of my horse, and I had punctured my lung. I had to go to the hospital. I had really damaged my back. And so I also had PTSD. And so I came back to school struggling with a lot of mental health issues, a lot of physical health issues, and dealt with a lot of bullying from my classmates who didn't already accept me to begin with, but now really didn't accept me because I was different and I was, had a rolling backpack and was not the cool kid. And so I think it's interesting going into adulthood and finding that actually these spaces that you do feel comfortable and where you are accepted and where you find people that you relate to, that those are so much more accessible as you get older. I think it's a little challenging, obviously, when you're like moving to a new space and trying to find your people, but I think you just have so much more access as an adult when you have a little bit more foresight, a little bit more mobility in terms of geography or mobility in terms of, well, I don't fit in these spaces. I don't feel comfortable in these spaces. So I can actually leave. Whereas as a kid, you just don't have that type of autonomy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I know that in the process of your academic journey, you started Accepted, as well as your YouTube channel and all of that. So how did that really come into existence? And then also managing all of that on top of coursework. And then on top of that, you also made a really massive move, which I think is pretty cool, but I love that you're, transparent with that whole process as well.
Yeah. So I guess there's like kind of three questions in there, which is like, how did the YouTube channel and Accepted get started? How is it that I balanced that? And then the move to London. So the first piece, I've always loved YouTube. I think I grew up, in the internet age and seeing creators and seeing them as authority figures or as people that I just really admired in general. And I loved like academia YouTube. Like StudyTube was my jam when I was in community college. It was honestly the thing that actually led me to want to stay in school, because I found all these study tip videos online that actually spoke to the way that I thought. And for example, I had a really difficult time with memory retention as a kid, and I found study tips on how it is to prepare for exams that I actually found really effective. And when I was in community college and I was looking to transfer, I looked online for resources on how to apply for as a transfer student, because I was in community college on and off for 4 years. I had been writing professionally full time for 3, and I just didn't understand the process. My parents had gone to community college, and my dad was a transfer student back in, the 70s, 80s. And so I was in a position where I just didn't have anybody I could really lean on for advice and to know what to do. And I went online, and I couldn't find anything on YouTube about being a transfer student, really. There was a couple of people that blogged about the experience, but they didn't really post informational content. And so I basically took the admissions advice for college and just tweaked it to fit my own circumstances. And by some miracle, I had an incredibly low GPA for the average to get into schools like UCLA. And so I applied on a whim, and I got these acceptance letters, and I was like, how is this even possible that I had gotten into these schools? I just felt completely flabbergasted, and I felt like I had tricked the system somehow. But I realized that going back to my essays later on and looking back at these essays now, what I was telling was a particular story with the essays, and I was using a tactic of narrative style that I had seen others using in college admissions, and so I had applied that to my own story when talking about transfer admissions. And then when I was leaving UCLA and I was applying to graduate school, I turned to YouTube for advice. There was nothing. I saw a couple of videos, and I saw a few little blog posts here and there, and there was some bits and pieces that I could find on the internet, but there was nothing cohesive. There was nothing that really spoke to my experience. And all of them, for example, just said, list out all of your academic achievements and whatever. But to me, the thing that was really valuable about my past and my experiences wasn't my academic ability. It was my ability as somebody who had persevered through challenges with my career and with being in community college and all of that. And so I just basically took all the advice that I had from online and my professors and other graduate students that I had talked to, and I basically just populated that to work on the application. And then again, by what felt like a miracle, I got into Oxford. And so that was the point when I got into Oxford, was when I basically had made the decision that I need to share this information with people, because this is information that I just kind of crowdsourced and made it possible for myself to get into these schools. But there are so many students that would benefit from this information. And I also hadn't really known anybody that had gone to the Oxbridge, and I wanted to savor the experience. And so I decided to start a YouTube channel, because that was the resource that I relied on the most myself. And so I started the YouTube channel the summer of 2019. And I always liked playing with cameras, and I started the YouTube channel in order to not only document my own experience, because I wanted to save it for myself, because it was something that I didn't want to lose. I wanted to maintain those memories, but I also wanted to share information for those that might have had similar experiences, and also to encourage others to create content as well, because I knew that I was representative of a particular type of non-traditional student experience, but I knew that there were other types of non-traditional and first-generation student experiences that we weren't seeing online. And the other thing was that I wanted to encourage others to do the same, and to see YouTube as a resource where we could share information. And so that's also when things with Accepted kind of essentially kicked off, is that I started posting the YouTube videos about graduate admissions. Having gotten to Oxford, I talked about transfer admissions, and I got comments, and then I got emails, and then I started doing these free calls with people to offer advice. And then it was, one call a week, and then it was one call a day, and then it was, I'm getting 10 emails a day. And it was just it blossomed very quickly. And that's when I decided that I would formalize it and make it a business and use that as a way to share information, but also to support my studies and to support like paying off debt and things of that nature. So that's how Accepted got started, technically. Accepted Society is a slightly different story, which I'm happy to get into. But then the second question of balancing everything. It's a question I get asked a lot, and I don't really have a perfect answer for it. But the one thing that I always add as a caveat when people ask me about how it is that I maintain, YouTube and Instagram and my PhD, my dissertation, and the businesses and maintaining a team, because now I think we have a team of 10 currently. Mm-hmm. And the first piece to it is that I've naturally been inclined to have multiple things on my plate ever since I was a kid. I've always had like side businesses or side projects or little things that I was doing on the side. I can't remember a time since the age of 12 that I haven't had a job of some kind of volunteer nature or paid. Mm-hmm. I've always had something. And so I think part of it is that I actually don't know how to just do one thing. I like physically don't know how to do it. I just feel very passionate about various things at the same time. And I've always held space for all of them. And there are times when some things take priority over others. And I think the piece to mention is, as we talk about moving and transitioning from a PhD student to a PhD candidate and moving abroad to London, is that with this move also came like a shift in my own priorities and how it is that I manage my time, because as I evolve as a person and as my studies and my research evolves, I have to shift priorities. And so the most recent news that I'm going to announce on my YouTube channel, and so technically I'm announcing it here first, is that I'm actually shutting down Accepted Consulting, so the actual admissions arm of my business. And that is a decision based on that I need to dedicate myself to the dissertation more, and that I also want to be able to make more content. And I think that there are different priorities and different ways of using time and relating oneself to time management in different stages and different chapters of one's life. And when I was in coursework, it was really easy to time block and say, okay, so I have class from this time to this time, and then I have lunch from this time to this time, and then I do my readings, and then I do my calls with my clients, and then I review client documents for an hour or two, and then do the rest of my readings. Like that was very possible when I was working full time. When I was in community college, I did time blocking. It worked when I was at UCLA. It worked when I started Accepted, when I was at Oxford, and when I started my PhD. But with each stage of one's education, especially as somebody goes into a PhD, and even more specifically, as you go into a new stage of life, that those things begin to shift, and those ways of mapping one's time evolves. And so I'd say I'm in a stage where it's evolving, or it has evolved a bit.
I feel like, just because I know that my parents have had a nonprofit in my city for about almost 30 years. So it's just like, I've always been used to going to events, going to meet people. And even when I was in school, it was like, yeah, I was going to school, but I was like really big theater kid, like musical theater. That was my thing. And even when I got to college, I'm like, well, I don't know. I just get really antsy with the idea of just going to work or school and then coming home. So I'm like, oh, I got to do something else. Like, I was involved in like student council. I was on like an honor society. I was involved in another club. I did a lot of internships. I was just trying to find ways to where I could just not be by myself all the time, because I'm also a really big introvert. So if I spend way too much, I know for a fact I spend way too much time with myself. If I have the ability to do, especially through the pandemic. But it's just like, I just like, when you fill your calendar up and it's like, well, I got this to do today. And it's like, well, I know that, I have a plan.
Yeah. And I feel like I was like the strongest proponent of filling one's time. And I feel like I also got a little bit over the reputation, especially on YouTube, as like the productivity, like doing everything kind of gal. And I think that it's interesting because growing up with, especially around my grandmother. So my grandmother's a Chinese immigrant and she started her business from scratch and she's a fashion designer. And watching her and the way she works, and she's just constantly on, and she's just constantly milling about and doing things and networking and working on a client's thing and going to a client's thing. And she just seemingly had such energy when I grew up. And I always wanted to emulate what she did. So that kind of like just buzzing about her. And I have maintained that for many years, especially going into the PhD. And I think it's interesting moving to a space where the work culture in London is very different than I'm used to. I'm from the Bay Area. I'm from California. I'm used to being just around conversations about startups and working and hustling just constantly. And coming here where there's more of a separation between one's work and one's life, it's very interesting how it is that that has an impact on the way that you begin to envision your own relationship to work and your own relationship to time. Because I love my work. I love my research. I think it's really important, not for the sake of me doing it. I just genuinely think it's important. Mm-hmm. And I love my YouTube channel. I love creating videos. I love creating content. I would do it even if no one was watching. And I'm constantly on and thinking about these things and seeing how the relationship to one's work is just very different in London with the people that I meet or with my partner, where they aren't just constantly thinking about it. It's just a very different shift. And that has resulted in me thinking about how it is that I navigate my own relationship to working. And as a result, I try to focus on the things about work that I'm really enjoying. And so, for example, I still work a lot, but I allow myself a little bit more space to focus on the things that I'm really passionate about, like photography or videography, and getting to learn those skills and getting to like play a little bit with it, rather than just feeling like, oh, I have to work for the sake of it producing something and the sake of it, for example, being resulting in profit. Now my relationship to it is, well, I just want to learn a skill, and if it benefits me in the long term, that's wonderful. But I also just want to do it for the sake of doing it.
Okay. And then, because I think that even for me, because I've studied in Europe for the most
Mm-hmm.
part, especially when I was in college, and then I went to Europe as an au pair, and I remember we were having a conversation with my host dad about like how our work culture is, and he's like, that doesn't make any sense. Why are you guys always working? And I'm like,
yeah,
what do you mean? You don't work this hard.
Yeah. Do you have an answer to that question? I'm still figuring that out for myself.
I don't even know. I mean, because I just felt like when I got to college and then beyond, it was more of like, okay, like what am I doing? Like, okay, like, graduated college, and it's like, well, if I don't have a job right away, then what am I doing? And I even tell my brother the same thing, because he just graduated college early in May, and so he's just kind of like, well, I'm just kind of, he works at Chick-fil-A like for the time being while he's finding a job. Mm-hmm. But I'm like, well, why don't you do something now, like, to at least, still be kind of like working on a project based on what you're doing. That's just why I started my nonprofit, because I was realizing that, throughout college, out of learning, like, it's now like 10 languages, it's like having a system around that. I'm like, well, like, why are people not teaching this in a certain way. So you get into projects where, you eventually discover new things, kind of like you were saying, because I know that you have the digital brand accelerator, like I think your second cohort is coming out.
Yeah. That's something it's just been a fun project for me. And I've been building the YouTube channel since I think I technically posted my first video in 2018, but I say I officially started my channel in 2019 because that's when I officially dedicated myself to the channel. And I have, I build businesses off of social media, and I've figured out different facets of how to create content in a way that's a little bit more sustainable. And a lot of the advice that I see online is, oh, well, do this to get this kind of growth and go viral. And what I realized after, being on YouTube for quite a long time is that if you've experienced virality, if you've experienced those moments where your content is seen by a lot of people, it actually doesn't generate a whole lot of connection and community. And actually, I find that it actually decreases one's motivation to keep creating, which seems counterintuitive because you'd think that, oh, well, I'm rising, I'm growing, I am getting more opportunities and more brand deals or whatever it may be. So this is the moment when I would be the most motivated to keep creating. But I actually find that the process, if you can kind of make the process the thing that you're invested in, that you tend to feel more invested in the actual product, in the actual videos, or in the actual brand that you're developing. And so I wanted to create a course that was a little bit different, and that allowed me to kind of play with the different things that I've learned as a content creator and as a business owner over the years, and try to share that and try to help other people that want to do the same. Because there are so many people that want to start YouTube channels. There's so many people that want to figure out a way to generate side income. And, there are tons and tons of offerings and courses and different things that one can do in order to learn how to do that. But I wanted to create a program that allowed me to share my knowledge about how to do it in such a way that's actually personalized to you, that has longevity, that's sustainable, and that people actually, enjoy doing in the long term, rather than just trying to build something quickly that you might burn out on.
Yeah. Okay, I see that. And even because I know that, like, when kind of shifting gears a little bit, like when you're like, because I do follow you on Instagram as well as YouTube, and I do love your content. Yeah. So in a way, like, I'm somewhat familiar with where your headspace is, like when you, especially with like a lot of your vlogs where you were talking about moving and then also working in your perspectives in the same time.
Yes.
I'm wondering, like, what's the process like for you to prepare for that move? I think, like, from what I'm seeing, obviously through social media, I know that, like I said, you were very transparent about that. So, like, what was that like? And also, how far in advance did you plan? Like, was this something that you like wanted to do day one versus like, oh, I decided I'm going to go to London?
Yeah. So I originally, when I started the PhD, I really thought that my project was going to lean more focused on Virginia, and so I was going to have to do my research primarily in the States. I knew I was going to have to come back to the UK for periods of time to do research, but it wasn't until, I would say, I think the second year of my PhD, that the way that I began asking questions about my research shifted, and so it looked like I was going to need to spend more time in the English archives. And I got funding to do a research trip here the summer of 2022. So I ended up coming to the UK for a month. And during that trip, I basically had said to myself, well, I know that year 4, I'm allowed to move. I don't have to be in residence in New Haven. And so I can technically move wherever I would like to. And how about we just see if London is where you want to be. And so I came here, I was doing research at Westminster, I was going to the Parliamentary Archives, I was going over to Kew, and I just I just immediately fell in love with the city. I felt so at peace here. Obviously I had gone to Oxford. I'd lived in the UK for a little while beforehand, so it's not like it was totally unfamiliar. But it was that summer when I basically had said to my friends and to my family, like, I'm moving to London next year. And I basically just made the statement, and then I began kind of just, honestly, I think the first stage of planning was just me making the decision and then just imagining what that process was going to look like, and then also kind of speaking that into existence with the way I was having conversations with my committee, or the way that I was having conversations with my friends and my family. Like, I was just basically stating it as fact, and I was like, I'll figure out the details later. And then I would say it was I started doing some research on visas, and I knew that there was basically two options for me. So there was the high potential individual visa, and then there was the university exchange. So I could technically have gotten like a student visa to do an exchange and come and work with a professor at UCL or at Royal Holloway. And that's what most students do that go away for research leave, is that they'll affiliate themselves with a university abroad, so that way you can get a visa that allows you to stay because you have that affiliation. And I actually decided not to do that, and the reason for that was that I honestly couldn't find anybody at UCL or at Royal Holloway that I felt like would be a good match for my research. And secondly, I wanted the opportunity to work in the UK if the opportunity presented itself. So I opted to get the high potential individual visa. And I actually made like a rather large mistake with the visa process, visa application, which is that I had begun applying a couple of months in advance because I knew that I was going to need to. However, with the HPI, you actually have to upload your physical diploma from the institution that you were affiliated with that gives you access to the HPI. And I thought you could just have, your transcript, because I got my diploma from UCLA in the mail to my grandparents' place. And so it's in storage somewhere. Don't know where. Mm-hmm. And so I'm filling out this application. I'm filling it out in I think it was March, and I was moving in May. And I was like, everybody said online it's 6 weeks in the US to get the HPI. I was like, okay, we got time. We're good. Lo and behold, I was not good. You need the actual diploma. Mm-hmm. And we could not find the physical copy of my diploma anywhere. And UCLA will not send me a digital copy. So UCLA has to send the diploma, and that has a 45-day wait time. Oh. So this is where I give the advice to anybody that is trying to live abroad: do your research and apply for things early. And check the fine print on what your documents are going to need. But anyhow, it wasn't that bad because I knew that I could be in the UK for up to 6 months as a visitor, as a US citizen, and I was coming back to the States in California in September. So I ended up getting to the UK and actually finishing the rest of the application when my diploma arrived. And I had just sent my diploma to my partner's place in the UK. And then I finished the application when I got here, and then had to finish the biometrics and everything when I went back to California. So definitely plan further in advance. I didn't know that you had to have a physical copy of the diploma. I just thought, the transcript says that I graduated from UCLA, so I'm assuming that that's enough, but it was not. So if you're looking to apply for the HPI or anything that is going to require any particular kind of unique documentation, just make sure you do that in advance.
I think I remember when I was applying to be an au pair because I was going to go to the embassy that was here in the U.S. And I remember that we had to have like an official document saying that my host family legally lives there. It's like, I don't know, it's not like a deed to their house, but it's like some type of official document. And they mailed it to me, and I was like, well, it wasn't going to get to me in time for the appointment. And they're like, well, we didn't make a copy of it, so I was like,
Oh no.
So when I got there, they just said, you know what, like, they're like, where are you going? I'm going to Cella. They're like, where's that? Because it was like some small town, like right outside of like Hanover. And they're like, well, oh, that's a really small city. They're like, just go to the foreigner's office, like on your visitor visa, and then just get a foreigner, it's called an Aufenthaltstitel, which is basically like a residence permit. And then you can exchange your visitor's visa for that. So, but then the other thing, the other thing about the EU is that if you're a U.S. citizen, like you can enter any EU country without a visa prior to. So it's just like, okay, yeah,
it's a bit challenging. I also, when I got to the UK, I traveled over with my dog, and so I actually had to go through the EU. So I had to go through Paris, and I got so much grief at border control going from France to the UK that I never had gotten any grief going through the airport in the UK. But yeah, that was an interesting experience because they also saw that I had a student visa from when I was at Oxford. And I got a bunch of questions about that. And they're like, well, how long are you staying? And I had to explain to them that I was applying for this other visa. And the guy who was at border control didn't know what the visa was. And so it's just, it was a day. It was a long day.
Yeah. So like your visa from Oxford, like how long does that usually last?
So the student visa, and this is why a lot of people go to the UK for graduate school. So you get the year that you're there for studying, and then you can actually apply for the like graduate scheme extension. So it gives you 2 extra years in the UK to find a job without sponsorship. And that was something that was really attractive to me when I had applied to go to Oxford, and I wasn't able to take advantage of it because of COVID. And I had started a PhD program regardless, but there are really excellent ways to stay in the UK and find employment if that is something that you're looking for. And one of those is the graduate extension scheme.
Okay. And even like when you kind of initially got to like the UK, like even like, I don't know if Oxford was like your first time specifically in the UK. But I'm interested to know like what your culture shocks were. As a linguist, for me, I'm always curious about that particular aspect. And I know that UK is very diverse in dialects. So sometimes like, I had a friend of mine who was like, yeah, I went to London. They were like, sounded like they were mumbling and then they understood each other, that kind of thing. So I'm wondering like, did you have like any type of like culture shocks or experiences like kind of trying to navigate the language, even though it's your native language?
Yeah, I have a funny story. So I studied abroad at Cambridge, and that was my first time ever going abroad. And that was in the summer of 2018. And there was an exchange where I had gone to a coffee shop, and everything in the UK closes really early compared to what I'm used to. So everything was closing at like 7. And I needed to study that night, and I didn't have a coffee maker, so I was desperate for a cup of coffee. And so I went to some creperie or something and was getting a coffee. And so I asked for, can I get a coffee with sugar and cream? And the guy looked at me like I was insane. And so he's like, yeah, I guess so. And so I sit down, and then he brings the coffee over, and he brings a canister of whipped cream. And so I said, oh, I'm really sorry. I just meant, like milk. And he's like, oh, okay. Yeah. Language barrier. I'm like, we both speak English. I don't understand. I didn't have that many like kind of major culture shocks when I was there the first time, or even when I was at Oxford. There was like some institutional culture shocks that I experienced. Like Oxford is very different than anywhere, I think, even in the UK, let alone, having come from an American university. But I've actually found like the biggest kind of culture shocks have been when I came to London, and especially when I met my partner, and he has like random little sayings that, they're very English and I have no idea what they mean. And so it's a source of constant entertainment, because the things that I say and the things that he says, and the way he says it. So like when I first got here and we were making the grocery list for the week, and I said, "Oh, can you get some zucchini?" He's like, "What is that?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" It's like a zucchini, like a green squash. And he's like, "What?" And so I looked it up on Google. I was like, "Oh, it's a courgette." Okay. my bad. So there's like little things like that, but honestly, I would say moving to the UK, it's not all that different in terms of it's at least easier for me to understand linguistically what's going on. The thing that I find the most, I think, different is just the approach to work, or the relationship one has to, I don't know, like the relationship one has like to the humanities. Like people in the UK actually care about history and the humanities, whereas seemingly the United States, my fellow Americans need a good dose of history in their daily routine.
I mean, I remember being a really big history nerd in high school. I mean, I was like the one that like used to watch a lot of historical documentaries for fun, just because
Me
it's
too.
like, and especially like as a person, who's multilingual, it's like knowing where certain words are derived from, or like sometimes where certain expressions come from. Because I always just love to know like where, like the origins. So,
well, as a history nerd that thinks about, there's that current trend right now about men thinking about the Roman Empire, and there's like, what's your Roman Empire? I'm like, early modern England.
oh yeah,
think about history constantly.
Yeah, I mean, because I was a really big fan of ancient history, just because also like, especially like biblical history, because that kind of like helped me out because with my own my own faith. So it's like understanding like how these things all like match up, because especially because the Bible's not written in like chronological order. Specifically, so I'm like, where is all of this stuff coming from? So like another kind of going further with that, like as you were getting acculturated, like how was it for you being able to build a strong community, or like a good support system, because sometimes that can make or break your experiences.
It really can, and I think that brings us back full circle to what I was talking about at the beginning, that I think your experience is so greatly impacted by your access to community. So this is one of the reasons I wanted to move to the UK, is that every time I was in the UK, I found it very easy to meet people, to make friends. And I think I have maybe a slightly easier time, just because I'm on social media and people know where I am geographically in the world. And I get messages from people that just, say, I also am a PhD student studying history, or I also create content, or whatever kind of connection point. And I've met a lot of people that way. And I've also met a lot of people because I built Accepted Society, which is a virtual community for students, professors, etc. And so I've actually met several of the people that I hang out with in London the most they were Accepted Society members, and that's how I met them. And so if I'm to offer kind of tangible advice on community, like finding community, like Facebook groups and other types of like community forums where you can find people that also are interested in the things that you're interested in. So that can be a sport, that can be reading, that can be whatever hobby, knitting, whatever it may be. Finding where those people tend to hang out and trying to meet them where you can share those interests, I think is the most ideal place to start. One of the girls at Accepted Society the other day told me about this thing. I can't remember that for the life of me what it's called, but in the US, there's in basically every city in the US, there's these group like meetups where people, they go, they meet, they say what they're reading, they grab a cup of coffee, and then they all like go, read for an hour and a half in this coffee shop. And then they meet up at the end and then they talk about what they were reading. And I was like, that seems like such a great way to make friends. And like, that just sounds absolutely delightful. And yeah, so things like that, just trying to find connection of people that are also doing things that you're interested in, I think is just the ideal way. Obviously, a lot of us make community and friendships through work or through school, but especially as an adult, like finding community through groups of shared hobbies, I think is honestly the ideal way to do it. And yeah, so most of the people I've met is because of social media, to be honest.
Yeah. And then also, like, because my other thing is like when you look at like maintaining your connections, because obviously, you're back in the UK, so it's like kind of like in your aspect of reintegrating and reconnecting with people, that connections that have maybe already there.
Yeah, so I still keep in touch with my friends from Oxford, and that was a time in my life where I feel like I had the best tight-knit community. And so I think making time to go back and see your friends and stay connected in those ways is so important. And it can be difficult, especially, as people start kind of going to their far corners of the world and starting their own lives. But I think there's always ways to try to keep those connections and, making little trips out of it. Like I go visit Oxford fairly often to go do research, but also just because I like being there, because it's a very inspiring space to me. Whenever I'm there, I can connect with old friends. And I think that's one benefit of if you can try to find ways to do like kind of mini travel. It's easier in the UK because of public transit and because of how close everything is. But I think trying to make the effort to travel little bits and pieces here and there to the spaces where you're already familiar, I think also has benefits. Don't get me wrong. I think it's wonderful to like travel to far-flung corners of the world, but I also think returning to spaces where you're familiar and reconnecting is also really wonderful.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, I think like since the last time I was in Paris, one of my friends, she has gotten married and had a child since 5 years ago. So I'm like, I don't know. At the same time, I realize if I go back, I still have we have so much to catch up on. So it's a lot to talk about. One of my friends from college, she went back to her home country in Bangladesh. Also, she has gotten married, had a child, and turned 30 in the same year. And so, like, it's fun to kind of like see like her son on social media and like how he's growing up. And I'm like, I gotta go see my nephew because like we're basically sisters at this point. So
yeah,
So
I think it's just important to like make that effort to go see your old friends and to stay connected in those ways.
mhm.
It's worth investing in.
Yeah. And so also like with with your move and also like with the fact that you mentioned that you're going to be spending time with, in the archives, which I've kind of seen over your vlogs, but like what kind of goes into you planning research? So obviously I'm assuming that, you go in like looking for something, over a period of time of however long you're going to be there. So what is your process like, when you're thinking of going abroad for research and just having like a general outline of what you're looking for?
So it's kind of like a 3-step process, I suppose. So first it starts with a hypothesis. So generally thinking, okay, so I want to find instances, if they exist, of children born to English fathers in England itself. So I look at things related to like mixed status. So this includes mixed race children, so Afro-English and Anglo-African children, but it also includes Indigenous children born to English fathers. It includes Irish children born to English fathers. And so looking for instances where I think that there may be occurrences in the archive, I have a general hypothesis. I see if other historians have written about it and if they've found instances of it. If not, then I take that hunch and then I go to the records where I think that they might be. So I can look at legal records. I look at a lot of parish records. The parish records are, especially in the early modern period, the place where births and deaths and marriages were recorded at your local parish. And if a historian has written about it, then they have a footnote. So historians have to mark our tracks whatever we do. And so if Holly Brewer mentions an archive document, a manuscript, then I'm following her genealogy of that research to go look at that archive and to look at that record. And so it all begins with a hypothesis. It begins with a hunch, and hoping to find some like fragment in the archive. And it's really challenging in the early modern period, especially with those of us that study race and gender in the early modern period, because as a linguist, as you know, like the language evolves and the way that they describe certain things it changes. And so, for example, if someone is referred to in what is deemed a racialized term today, it might also denote like religious affiliation more so than skin color. It might also denote like regional status, like where they came from and things of that nature. So it's trying to figure out what might be in the archive, so what might be in the record, and thinking about search terms, and then also working closely with archivists to say, this is what my project is. These are the things I'm generally looking for. Have you seen anything, or do you recommend anything that you think I should be looking at? So it's a puzzle. It's a very complicated puzzle, but it feels a little bit like a wild goose chase at times, because most of the times when you go to the archives, you don't find anything. And you're looking through these records and you're like, oh, it's not really what I'm looking for. But the thing is that I think that's also part of the journey, is seeing those records, even if it doesn't necessarily say what you are looking for, and then tweaking it and saying, okay, so it doesn't say what I thought it was going to say, but it might also say something that's actually more important. And so, for example, I was looking at records related to early modern representations of Blackness and of servitude in like playwriting. And I, one rabbit hole leads to another, and then I find like a reference that's actually related to like an Irish child and not someone of African descent, as I would have assumed. So then that leads me down another set of questions. And so being a historian is just, it's kind of like being a detective.
Okay. I feel like it's like easy to go down rabbit holes because you're like, oh, well, I'm curious about this. And then all of a sudden you spend more time like on something else, kind of putting the pieces together.
Yeah, the questions always evolve. And that's what I think is really interesting about the genealogy of research. And that's why I wanted to have the YouTube channel, is because the research changes, the question changes. And so I wanted some way to record that process and to show what that process actually looks like.
Okay. And so in the long term, like what kind of impact do you want your research to have?
So the way that the history of slavery has been discussed is really focused on the New World colonies and West Africa. And while historians, I think, do really great work to show the complexities of the history of race making and of slavery have focused on how it has a genealogy that stretches all the way back to the slave trade in the Black Sea. And we have a lot of work that's been done to show that, the Mediterranean is the kind of initial site in which we begin to see racial slavery emerge. I also want those histories to talk about how it is that the English were involved in this formation of a racial definition, of a racial order, of a legal order. And oftentimes the history books and the way that we teach children about slavery is like, oh, this is something, especially in the colonies, that kind of emerged due to a need for labor. However, from my calculation, from my reading of the archives and my reading of the work that other historians have done, is that this kind of history of forced servitude existed in England before they were involved in the slave trade, before they were even on the North American continent, and trying to tell a history of how that came to be and try to complicate the way that we see that history. So that way, hopefully when we teach children about the past, it's not just, oh, well, it's just kind of this unthinking decision of like, oh, well, then we needed labor to till tobacco, and so therefore it resulted in this like millions of people system of genocide and of slavery and of forced capture and etc. And so it's a history that I didn't learn as a kid. It's a history that I didn't even get to learn as a teenager. And it's one that I think needs to be taught. And so I'm just hoping that by making a slight contribution that we can add a little bit more nuance to that story.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially because I know now, like, it feels like a lot of people are trying to alter history, or it's like kind of like chopping up like what we specifically learned. Because like I was saying earlier with watching documentaries, it was more of like I kind of was just like, there's things that I wanted to know more about, and they kind of cut it short and just kind of gave like an overview versus more details.
Yes, I unfortunately have to go run a study session for Acceptance Society. So I have to wrap up. But I'm happy to answer one more question. I just have to get it signed on.
Yeah. All right, no problem. Yeah. So my final question actually is just in a matter of what do you feel like in retrospect how have you been able to navigate, common excuses like, it's too expensive to do this, or I don't understand visas and everything's complicated, or I couldn't do something like that. What in retrospective do you feel like would kind of, be more of advice towards, towards kind of combating that?
I think if we really want something, we will make it happen. And it's absolutely possible to make moving abroad happen if that's something that you genuinely want and you're willing to ask for help and you're also willing to take the time to do the research. However, somebody framed this to me in a way that I hadn't thought of before. So I'm very like risk tolerant. So I love trying new things. I try new skills. I'm not afraid to fail. And that is something that comes with, remarkable. It's a remarkable privilege to have that mindset. And it's not just because of like socioeconomic position, but also like how it is that you're raised and how it is that you view travel and how it is that you view risk. And so for the people that think that, it really couldn't ever be them, just showing them examples of other people that have in very similar positions been able to move abroad or been able to make these things happen. And there are so many different ways to navigate it. So I help people apply for scholarships. There's other ways to get yourself across the world to study abroad or to move abroad that make it feasible. It just has to be something that you genuinely want to kind of throw your weight into.
Well, thank you so much for your time. So where can people find you outside of this?
Yeah, so you can find me at Kaelyn Grace Apple on Instagram, TikTok, and on YouTube. I also have a personal website where you can find out about the Digital Brand Accelerator or Acceptance Society. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you on the various platforms. And thank you all so much for listening.
All right. Thanks so much for your time, Kaelyn.
Thank you, Jazz.